Every family has that one person who never seems to catch a break. For the Mercer family, that person was Eli, the dreamer who fixed cars for a living while his brother became a lawyer and his ex-wife moved on to someone more successful. When Eli inherited his grandfather's old garage, everyone laughed at him. His brother called it complete garbage. His ex-wife said he'd only inherited problems. His teenage daughter just shook her head at another one of Dad's disappointments. But inside that rundown garage sat two forgotten cars covered in dust. As Eli started working on them, he found hidden compartments and strange modifications. His grandfather had been more than just an old man. He'd been a secret engineer who built illegal race cars in the 1960s. One car was worth millions. Under the floor, Eli found blueprints for a revolutionary engine that had been lost for decades. The garage everyone mocked was hiding a $9 million treasure. But would this discovery finally prove that Eli was more than just the family failure? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against the windows of Mercer's auto repair like impatient fingers, each drop echoing the rhythm of Eli's mounting worries. He stood behind the counter of his small shop, watching the water cascade down the glass, while his coffee grew cold in his hands. At 43, Eli Mercer had the kind of face that wore its disappointments honestly, gentle brown eyes that still held hope despite years of setbacks, and hands permanently stained with motor oil that told the story of a man who believed in fixing things, even when they seemed beyond repair. The shop itself reflected its owner's circumstances. 3 service bays housed vehicles in various states of repair, their hoods propped open like mouths crying for help. The waiting area consisted of 4 mismatched chairs and a coffee table stacked with automotive magazines from 2 years ago. A faded family photograph sat on the counter, Eli with his arm around his ex-wife Sarah and their daughter Emma, all of them smiling at what had once been a promising future. "Dad, you're staring at nothing again," Emma's voice cut through his reverie. At 16, she possessed the sharp observation skills that came from watching her father navigate life's obstacles with stubborn optimism. Her dark hair, so much like her mother's, framed a face that held both her father's gentleness and her mother's practical strength. "Just thinking about your grandfather's funeral tomorrow," Eli said, turning from the window. "Strange how you can miss someone you barely knew." Emma looked up from her homework spread across a corner table. "Tell me about him again. The real stuff, not the family stories." Eli settled into the chair across from her, grateful for the conversation. "Frank Mercer was what your Uncle Marcus would call difficult. Lived alone in that house on Maple Street for as long as I can remember. When I was little, maybe 7 or 8, he taught me how to hold a wrench properly. Showed me how to listen to an engine, really listen, to understand what it was trying to tell you. But then he just stopped talking to everyone." "Not stopped, exactly. He became distant. Your grandmother used to say he carried some kind of sadness that made it hard for him to be around people. After she died, he barely spoke to anyone in the family, except for a few words at holidays." Eli's voice carried the weight of old regrets. "I should have tried harder to connect with him." The bell above the door chimed, and Marcus Mercer stepped inside, shaking rain from his expensive coat. At 45, Marcus carried himself with the confidence that came from success, tailored suit, perfect haircut, and the kind of smile that had served him well in courtrooms and boardrooms. He surveyed his brother's modest shop with barely concealed judgment. "Still working late, I see," Marcus said, his tone carrying the familiar note of superiority that had defined their relationship since childhood. Sarah called. "She's concerned about Emma spending so much time here instead of focusing on her studies." Emma's jaw tightened. "I get straight A's, Uncle Marcus, and I like helping Dad." "Of course you do, sweetheart. But your mother thinks you should be around more successful influences." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Eli felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settle on his shoulders. "Emma's welcome here any time. She's learning valuable skills," Marcus picked up the family photograph, studying it with calculated interest. Remember when this was taken? You still thought that expansion loan was going to work out. What was it? The second mortgage on the house that Sarah had to clean up during the divorce. Marcus. Eli's voice carried a warning tone, but his brother continued, I'm not trying to be cruel, Eli. I'm being realistic. Tomorrow we bury a man who left nothing but problems behind. An old house that needs thousands in repairs, and apparently some kind of garage or workshop that's probably condemned by now. The family lawyer said Frank left it all to you, specifically. Lucky you. Emma slammed her textbook shut. Why are you so mean to him? Marcus softened slightly. I'm not mean, Emma. I just worry about your father's tendency to see opportunity where others see responsibility. Remember the vintage motorcycle phase? The antique restoration business that lasted 6 months? Each mention stung because they were true. Eli had chased dreams with the dedication of a man who refused to accept that some people were meant for smaller lives. The motorcycle restoration had failed when he couldn't find enough customers. The antique business had collapsed under the weight of his inexperience with marketing and overhead costs. This is different, Eli said quietly. I'm not chasing anything. I'm just inheriting what Frank left behind, which is exactly what worries me. You see inheritance, I see liability. That property has been sitting empty for months since Frank went into the nursing home. God knows what condition it's in. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's arrival. At 41, she moved through the world with the efficient grace of someone who had learned to depend only on herself. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the scrubs that marked her long shifts as a registered nurse at County General. I thought I'd find you all here, she said, her tone neutral but tired. Emma, you missed dinner again. I ate here, Emma replied. Dad made sandwiches. Gas station sandwiches don't count as proper nutrition. Sarah's criticism wasn't harsh, just weary. She'd fought these battles too many times. I came to discuss the custody arrangement. Emma's grades are excellent, but her counselor says she seems distracted lately. Eli's heart clenched. After 2 years of divorce proceedings, the custody arrangement was still fragile. Emma spent weekdays with her mother and weekends with him, but Sarah held the legal authority to modify that schedule if she deemed it necessary. She's not distracted, Eli protested. She's learning mechanical skills. She can diagnose engine problems better than half my customers. That's exactly my point. She should be focused on college preparation, not spending her free time in a garage. Dr. Peterson at the guidance office says Emma has the potential for pre-med if she applies herself. Emma's face flushed with frustration. What if I don't want pre-med? What if I like working with my hands? You're 16, Sarah said with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. You don't know what you want yet. Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should table this discussion until after the funeral. We're all under stress. The next morning, Frank Mercer was buried under a grey sky that threatened more rain. The service was small, immediate family, a few elderly neighbours, and the pastor from the Lutheran church Frank had attended sporadically. Eli found himself studying the faces of the handful of mourners, wondering what stories they might tell about his grandfather that he'd never heard. The reading of the will took place that afternoon in the office of Harold Whitman, the family's longtime attorney. Whitman, approaching 70 himself, had known Frank for decades and spoke of him with genuine warmth. Frank was particular about his affairs, Whitman explained, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the documents. He left specific instructions for the distribution of his estate. Marcus leaned forward expectantly. As the older son and more successful brother, he'd assumed the bulk of any inheritance would flow through him. The house and primary assets go to both sons equally, Whitman continued. However, Frank made specific provisions for his workshop and garage. These properties, along with their contents, are left exclusively to Eli. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances while Emma looked puzzled. What garage? Eli asked. Frank owned a separate property on Industrial Road, been in the family for 40 years, apparently. He used it as his personal workshop. Whitman handed Eli a set of keys and a sealed envelope. "He left this for you specifically." Eli's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note in Frank's careful script, "For the boy who still listens to engines. Take care of what's inside. It's worth more than they'll understand." Marcus couldn't contain his frustration any longer. "A garage? That's what he gets? Some old building that's probably falling down?" "Marcus," Sarah said quietly, but her expression showed she shared his concern. "No, seriously. This is exactly what I was talking about yesterday." Eli inherits responsibility disguised as opportunity. "How much are the property taxes? What about insurance? Maintenance costs?" Whitman consulted his files. "The taxes are current. Frank maintained the property conscientiously, but what's in it?" Emma asked, her curiosity overriding the adult tensions. "According to the records, personal effects, tools, and what Frank described as automotive projects." Whitman's tone suggested he wasn't entirely certain himself. The drive to Industrial Road took 20 minutes through the older part of town, where small manufacturing and repair businesses lined the street. Frank's garage sat behind a chain-link fence, a substantial brick building that looked solid despite its age. Eli parked the car and stood staring at the property that was somehow now his. "It's bigger than I expected," Sarah admitted reluctantly. The garage door was secured with a heavy padlock that yielded to one of Frank's keys. As the door rolled up, afternoon sunlight revealed the interior that would change everything. 2 cars sat in the shadows like sleeping giants. One was a 1967 Shelby Cobra, its distinctive curves unmistakable even under a heavy canvas tarp. The other appeared to be a 1969 Dodge Charger, also covered but revealing enough of its profile to suggest serious power beneath its sheet. "Jesus," Marcus whispered. His earlier dismissal forgotten, Emma stepped forward, her mechanical instincts drawing her toward the vehicles. "Dad, these aren't just old cars. These are classics." Eli moved slowly toward the Cobra, his heart pounding. Even covered in dust, even sitting in darkness for who knew how long, the car radiated presence. He pulled back the tarp carefully, revealing midnight blue paint that still held its luster. "Frank restored these?" Sarah asked, her voice reflecting new respect for the old man she'd never really known. Along the walls, pegboard displayed tools arranged with military precision. Not just standard automotive tools, but specialized equipment Eli had only seen in professional racing shops. A workbench ran the length of one wall, its surface scarred by decades of use, but organized with the care of a master craftsman. "Look at this," Emma called from beside the Charger. She'd found a wooden toolbox, clearly handmade, with F. Mercer burned into its lid. Inside, nested in fitted compartments, were instruments that spoke of serious automotive work: micrometers, torque specification sheets, and tools modified for purposes Eli couldn't immediately identify. Marcus had recovered from his initial surprise and was now calculating. Even if they need restoration work, these cars are worth serious money. The Cobra alone could be worth 6 figures if it's authentic, but Eli wasn't hearing the dollar signs his brother was counting. He was listening to what the garage itself was trying to tell him. This wasn't just a storage space. It was a workshop where someone had spent years perfecting something. The question was what? "We should have them appraised," Sarah said practically. "If there's real value here, it changes Emma's college fund situation and the liability picture," Marcus added. "Maybe this inheritance isn't the burden I thought." Emma had wandered to a corner where a desk sat covered with papers and notebooks. "Dad, come look at this." The desk held what appeared to be technical drawings, maintenance logs, and photographs. The photos showed both cars in various stages of work, some apparently taken decades ago based on their color and quality. In several shots, a younger version of Frank Mercer could be seen working on engine components, his face concentrated and serious. "He built these himself?" Eli asked, studying a drawing that showed engine modifications he'd never seen before. "Or rebuilt them," Emma corrected, pointing to a maintenance log. "Look at these dates. He's been working on them for 20 years or more." As the afternoon light began to fade, the family stood in the garage, surrounded by questions. What had Frank Mercer been doing in this space for all those years? Why had he left it specifically to Eli? And most importantly, what was the real story behind the grandfather who'd been a stranger to his own family? Marcus broke the contemplative silence. Whatever this is, we need to secure it. These cars can't just sit here while we figure out what to do. I want to understand what he was working on first, Eli said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Frank left this to me for a reason. I think I owe it to him to find out what that reason was. Sarah looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen in years, something that might have been respect. Just be careful, Eli. Don't let this become another project that consumes more than it gives back. As they locked the garage and prepared to leave, Eli found himself looking back at the building with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Inside those walls waited answers to questions he'd never thought to ask about the grandfather, who'd remained a mystery his entire life. Emma slipped her hand into his as they walked to the car. Dad, I think Grandpa Frank chose you because you're the only one who would take the time to understand what he was really doing. The weight of that responsibility settled on Eli's shoulders as they drove home through the gathering dusk. Tomorrow, he would return to the garage and begin the process of uncovering Frank Mercer's secrets. He had no idea that what he found would not only change his understanding of his grandfather, but transform his family's opinion of the man they'd always seen as a disappointment. 3 days after the funeral, Eli returned to the garage alone. The morning sun streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above the two covered vehicles like memories refusing to settle. He'd spent the intervening days researching classic car values and trying to understand what Frank had left him. But the internet searches only raised more questions. The Shelby Cobra's top came off easier the second time, revealing details he'd missed in the excitement of discovery. The paint wasn't just well-maintained, it was perfect, as if the car had been restored yesterday. Chrome gleamed without a spot of rust, and the leather interior showed no wear, despite what had to be decades of age. Eli ran his fingers along the hood, feeling for the familiar catches that would let him examine the engine. When the hood lifted, he stopped breathing. The engine bay was immaculate, but more than that, it was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being damaged, but wrong in the sense that what he was looking at shouldn't exist. The engine block appeared stock, but subtle modifications caught his trained eye immediately. The intake manifold had been customized with additional ports. The headers weren't standard manufacture. Most intriguingly, several components seemed to be made from materials he didn't recognize, metals that looked lighter than steel, but stronger than aluminum. What were you building, Frank? He whispered to the empty garage. The sound of his own voice reminded him of the toolbox Emma had discovered. He retrieved it from the workbench, admiring again the craftsmanship of the wooden case. Inside, nestled in their fitted compartments, were tools that told a story of precision work. But as he lifted the top tray to examine the lower level, something shifted. A small compartment he'd missed before had a tiny brass clasp. When pressed, it revealed a space just large enough for what lay inside, a key unlike any he'd ever seen. The metal was dark, almost black, and the key's teeth were cut in a pattern that seemed almost artistic in its complexity. Eli turned the key over in his palm, noting its substantial weight and the way it seemed to warm to his touch. On the bow of the key, tiny letters were engraved. C1, C2. C1, C2, he repeated aloud, then looked at the two cars. Car 1, Car 2! The Cobra was obviously C1, which made the Charger C2, but what did the key open? He approached the Cobra methodically, searching for anything that might accept the unusual key. The glove compartment opened with the standard latch. The trunk release was mechanical, but as he ran his hands along the interior panels, he felt something that made his pulse quicken. Behind the passenger seat, where the panel met the floor, his fingers found a small depression. When pressed, a section of the panel slid aside, revealing a keyhole that matched his mysterious key perfectly. The key turned with the smooth action of a precision instrument. Inside the hidden compartment was a manila envelope, its contents protected by decades of careful storage. Eli's hands shook slightly as he withdrew a collection of documents that would change everything he thought he knew about his grandfather. The first item was a racing program from 1968, but not from any sanctioned track. Underground Racing Circuit Summer Series was printed in bold letters across a cover that featured photographs of modified streetcars in action. Inside, driver profiles showed men with names like Ghost, Lightning, and the Phantom, Frank Mercer's photograph appeared on page 7 under the name Shadowmaker. Eli stared at his grandfather's younger face, recognizing the focused intensity he'd seen in Emma's eyes when she worked on mechanical problems. But this wasn't the reclusive old man he remembered. This Frank Mercer looked dangerous, confident, and completely alive. The racing program detailed events that had taken place on closed roads, abandoned airstrips, and private tracks. Prize money was listed in amounts that seemed impossible for 1968. Some races offering purses of $20,000 or more. The language was cryptic, referring to special modifications, experimental components, and prototype testing. Additional documents revealed the scope of what Frank had been involved in. Technical specifications showed engine modifications that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 1960s technology. Racing results indicated that Shadowmaker had been remarkably successful, winning or placing in nearly every event he'd entered. But the most disturbing document was a newspaper clipping from 1969. The headline read, "Underground Racing Driver Missing, Presumed Dead." The article described how Frank Mercer, known in racing circles as Shadowmaker, had disappeared after his car went off a mountain road during a high-stakes race. The wreckage had been found, but his body never recovered. Eli's hands trembled as he read his grandfather's obituary from 46 years ago. According to the newspaper, Frank Mercer had died at age 28, leaving behind a wife and 2 young sons. But the man Eli had known his entire life had been that same Frank Mercer, living quietly in town, raising those sons, attending family gatherings with the secret knowledge that the world believed him dead. The implications were staggering. Why had Frank faked his death? What had he been running from? And what did it mean for the cars sitting in this garage? The sound of a car door slamming interrupted his racing thoughts. Through the garage window, he saw Sarah's sedan parked outside. She entered carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression she reserved for serious conversations. "I brought the divorce modification papers," she said without preamble. "I want to discuss supervised visitation." Eli looked up from the documents scattered around him, his mind still reeling from the discovery. "Supervised visitation? Sarah, what are you talking about?" "Emma came home yesterday talking about secret compartments and mysterious keys. She's becoming obsessed with this place, just like you're becoming obsessed. It's not healthy. She's interested in her grandfather's legacy. There's nothing unhealthy about a daughter wanting to understand her family history." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she noticed the papers in Eli's hands. "What is all this?" The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Eli could show Sarah what he'd discovered, share the burden of Frank's incredible secret, and potentially gain her support. Or he could protect the discovery until he understood its full implications. "Racing programs from the 60s, he said carefully. Frank apparently had an interest in motorsports. "Racing?" Sarah's voice carried the familiar note of exasperation. "Eli, please tell me you're not planning to get involved in some vintage racing fantasy. We've been through this with your other projects." The comparison stung because it wasn't entirely unfair. His previous ventures had been driven more by enthusiasm than practical planning. But this felt different. This felt like something that had been waiting for him specifically. "I'm not planning anything except understanding what Frank left me." Sarah moved closer, her nurse's instincts picking up on his emotional state. "You're shaking. What did you really find in here?" Before Eli could answer, Emma's voice called from outside. "Dad, Mom, are you both here?" Emma appeared in the garage doorway, carrying her school backpack and wearing the eager expression that meant she'd been thinking about mechanical problems all day. When she saw the papers spread across the Cobra's hood, her eyes lit up with curiosity. "Are those the racing documents from the desk?" she asked, approaching the car. "Emma, we need to talk about your spending time here," Sarah interrupted. "Your guidance counselor called. You missed your college prep meeting because you were helping your father with a restoration project." Emma's face flushed with frustration. "I rescheduled the meeting. And this isn't just a restoration project, Mom. This is important. Important how? Important enough to jeopardize your academic future. Maybe my academic future isn't what you think it should be. Maybe I want to do something different with my life." The argument that had been building for months finally erupted. Sarah's fears about Emma following in Eli's. Footsteps of financial instability crashed against Emma's emerging sense of her own interests, and Eli's growing determination to uncover Frank's secrets. "You're 16 years old," Sarah said, her voice rising. "You don't get to make life-altering decisions based on romantic notions about working with your hands. And you don't get to make them for me based on your disappointment in Dad." Emma shot back. The words hung in the garage air like an accusation. Sarah's face went pale, and Eli felt the familiar weight of being the family's source of conflict. "That's enough," he said quietly. "This isn't about me or my failures. This is about Emma having the freedom to explore her interests." Sarah turned on him, with years of frustration, finally finding voice. "Your interests, Eli, not hers. Yours. Just like the motorcycle restoration was going to be a father-daughter project, and the antique business was going to teach her entrepreneurship. How many projects does she have to watch you abandon before you admit you're using her enthusiasm to justify your own impractical dreams?" The accusation hit home because it contained enough truth to wound. Eli had involved Emma in previous ventures, and she had watched them fail. But this felt different, because it wasn't his dream. It was Frank's legacy, and Frank had specifically chosen him to receive it. Emma looked between her parents, seeing the familiar dynamic that had contributed to their divorce. "Stop," she said firmly. "Both of you stop. Dad's not dragging me into anything. I want to be here. I want to understand what Great-Grandpa Frank was doing, and I want to learn from Dad, because he's the best mechanic I know." Sarah's expression softened at her daughter's defense, but her concerns remained. "Sweetheart, I just want you to have choices. I don't want you to limit yourself based on what feels comfortable right now, and I don't want to limit myself based on what you think is safe," Emma replied. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle pulling up outside. Through the window, they could see a black luxury sedan with tinted windows. A man in an expensive suit emerged and approached the garage with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Are you Eli Mercer?" the man asked, extending a business card. "My name is Richard Blackwood. I represent certain collectors who have an interest in vintage automobiles." Eli accepted the card, noting the expensive paper and embossed lettering. "How did you know about the cars?" Blackwood smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Word travels quickly in collector circles when significant vehicles surface. I understand you've recently inherited some interesting pieces from your grandfather." "They're not for sale," Eli said instinctively. "Of course not, but they are remarkable specimens, and my clients are prepared to make very generous offers." "May I?" Blackwood gestured toward the Cobra. Before Eli could object, Blackwood was circling the car with the practiced eye of an expert appraiser. His interest seemed to intensify when he noticed the racing documents spread on the hood. "Ah," he said softly, picking up the 1968 racing program. "Underground racing circuit. I haven't seen one of these in decades." Something in Blackwood's tone triggered alarm bells in Eli's mind. This wasn't casual collector interest. This was recognition. "You're familiar with underground racing?" Sarah asked, her suspicion matching Eli's. I'm familiar with automotive history, Mrs. Mercer, and these documents suggest your grandfather was involved in some very exclusive circles. Blackwood's attention had shifted to the hidden compartment, still open in the Cobra's interior. May I ask what else you discovered? Eli moved protectively closer to the car. I think you should leave. Blackwood's smile became more predatory. Mr. Mercer, you may not understand the significance of what you've inherited. These aren't just classic cars. If they're what I think they are, they represent a piece of racing history that certain people have been searching for decades. What people? Emma asked, her journalist instincts engaging. People who understand that some automotive innovations were too advanced for their time. People who recognize that your grandfather was more than just a backyard mechanic. Blackwood reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card case. My clients are prepared to offer $2 million for both vehicles and any associated documentation. The figure hung in the air like a challenge. $2 million would solve every financial problem Eli faced. It would secure Emma's college education, eliminate the custody concerns, and prove to his family that he wasn't the failure they'd always seen. Sarah's sharp intake of breath suggested she was thinking the same thing. But something about Blackwood's intensity, combined with the morning's revelations about Frank's faked death, made Eli hesitate. I need time to consider, he said finally. Of course. But don't take too long, Mr. Mercer. Opportunities like this don't remain open indefinitely. Blackwood handed him another card. I'll be in touch. After Blackwood left, the garage felt smaller, as if his presence had somehow contaminated the space. Sarah stared at Eli with an expression he couldn't read. $2 million, she said quietly. I know. That's Emma's future. That's your future. That's the answer to every financial worry we've had. I know, Eli repeated. Emma moved to the Charger and began pulling off its top. Before we decide anything, shouldn't we see what's in the other car? As the canvas fell away, the 1969 Dodge Charger revealed itself in the afternoon light. Like the Cobra, it was in impossibly perfect condition, its black paint gleaming as if it had just left the showroom. But something about its proportions seemed wrong. The stance was lower, more aggressive, and the exhaust pipes were larger than stock. Emma found the second hidden compartment almost immediately, as if the pattern from the first car had prepared her for what to look for. The compartment in the Charger contained similar documents, but with a crucial difference. These papers were more recent, some dated within the last 5 years. They included correspondence from automotive museums, collector organizations, and what appeared to be government agencies. Names, phone numbers, and references to classified automotive research and national security implications. Frank Mercer hadn't just faked his death and disappeared from racing circles. He'd continued to be involved in automotive innovation for decades, working with organizations that operated far above the level of hobby collectors. And now, Richard Blackwood and his mysterious clients knew exactly where to find what they were looking for. The next morning, Eli arrived at the garage before sunrise, carrying coffee and a legal pad filled with questions that had kept him awake most of the night. Emma had convinced Sarah to let her skip her first period study hall to help with the historical research, a compromise that satisfied no one but bought them time to investigate further. The 1968 racing program lay open on Frank's workbench, and in the clear morning light, details emerged that had been obscured by the previous day's emotional revelations. The underground racing circuit wasn't just about illegal street racing. It was about testing automotive technologies that legitimate manufacturers couldn't or wouldn't explore. Look at this, Emma said, pointing to a technical specification sheet tucked between the program's pages. Grandpa Frank's car, the one they called Shadowmaker, had modifications that shouldn't have been possible in 1968. Eli studied the specifications, engine displacement, compression ratios, and power output numbers that exceeded anything he'd seen from that era. But more intriguingly, there were references to materials and engineering approaches that seemed decades ahead of their time. Experimental alloys, he read aloud. Computational fluid dynamics. Electronic ignition mapping. Emma, some of this technology didn't exist commercially until the 1980s. The implications were staggering. Either the document was a fraud, or Frank Mercer had been involved in automotive research that was 30 years ahead of its time. The garage door's rumble interrupted their investigation. Marcus stood outside with two other men, one carrying a camera and the other holding what appeared to be official documentation. "Eli, I brought an insurance appraiser and a photographer," Marcus announced, his tone suggesting this was a reasonable precaution rather than an intrusion. "If these cars are worth serious money, we need proper documentation for estate purposes." The appraiser, a thin man named Henderson, who moved with the methodical precision of someone who evaluated valuable objects for a living, approached the Cobra with professional interest. But as he began his examination, his expression shifted from routine assessment to genuine puzzlement. "This is remarkable," Henderson murmured, running his hands along the Cobra's modified engine components. "I've appraised hundreds of classic Shelby Cobras, but I've never seen work of this quality. These modifications are museum grade. What does that mean in terms of value?" Marcus asked, clearly focused on the financial implications. Henderson continued his examination, paying particular attention to the engine bay and interior modifications. Standard 1967 Cobra, even in excellent condition, might be worth $300,000 to $400,000. But this level of custom work, if it's period correct and authentic, could add substantially to that figure. The photographer began documenting the cars from every angle, his flash illuminating details that natural light had obscured. But as he worked around the Charger, something caught his attention. "There's something unusual about this car's proportions," he said, lowering his camera. "The wheelbase looks extended, and the rear suspension components aren't stock." Emma moved to examine what the photographer had noticed. "Dad, come look at this. The rear axle assembly is completely different from standard Charger specifications." Eli crawled under the car with a flashlight, his mechanic's eye immediately recognizing that what he was seeing defied conventional understanding. The suspension components were not only custom, but appeared to be made from materials he didn't recognize. The differential housing was larger than stock, and the drive shaft showed engineering approaches that seemed almost futuristic. "This isn't just a restored car," he said, sliding out from under the vehicle. "This is a completely re-engineered machine." Henderson's professional composure was beginning to crack. "Mr. Mercer, I need to ask you some direct questions. Do you have any documentation about who performed this work? Any records of parts acquisition or engineering specifications?" Before Eli could answer, the garage door rumbled again. This time, it was Tony Carruthers, the owner of Classic Auto Restoration, the most reputable vintage car shop in the county. Tony was in his 60s, with the kind of deep knowledge that came from 40 years of working on vehicles that most people only saw in museums. "Marcus called me," Tony explained, studying the two cars with an expression of growing amazement. "He said you'd inherited some interesting pieces, but this is extraordinary." Tony approached the vehicles with the reverence of a man who understood automotive history. But as he examined the engine modifications and suspension work, his demeanor became increasingly serious. "Eli, where did your grandfather acquire these vehicles?" "We think he built them himself. We found racing documents suggesting he was involved in underground racing in the 1960s. Tony was quiet for a long moment, running his hands along components that clearly fascinated and puzzled him. "I need to tell you something. I knew your grandfather." The words stopped all activity in the garage. Eli, Emma, Marcus, and even Henderson turned to stare at Tony. "You knew Frank?" "Not well, but we crossed paths occasionally. He came into my shop maybe 3 or 4 times over the years, always looking for very specific parts. Unusual parts. Things that weren't readily available through normal channels." Tony's expression grew thoughtful. He never talked about what he was working on, but he had the kind of technical knowledge that impressed me. "And I don't impress easily." Emma leaned forward eagerly. "What kind of parts? high-performance components that were typically reserved for professional racing teams, custom machined pieces that cost more than most people's annual car payments. But what struck me most was his understanding of advanced engineering principles. He talked about metallurgy and aerodynamics like a professional engineer. The photographer had continued documenting the cars during Tony's story, and now he made a discovery that changed everything. Wedged behind the Charger's battery, barely visible unless someone was specifically looking for it, was a small metal plate with engraved numbers and letters. "Is this some kind of identification tag?" he asked, carefully removing the plate. Tony examined the metal tag, and his face went pale. "This is a Department of Defense contractor identification number." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Henderson stopped his appraisal. Marcus's financial calculations halted, and Emma stared at the small piece of metal that suggested her great-grandfather's involvement in projects far more significant than underground racing. "What does that mean?" Eli asked. Tony was quiet for several moments, clearly weighing what to share. "It means your grandfather's work might have involved government contracts, military or aerospace applications. This isn't just about racing anymore." As if summoned by the revelation, Richard Blackwood appeared at the garage entrance. His timing was too perfect to be coincidental. "Good morning," he said smoothly, taking in the assembled group with calculating eyes. "I hope I'm not interrupting important work." Henderson looked uncomfortable. "We're conducting an estate appraisal." "Of course. And what have you discovered about these remarkable vehicles?" The question hung in the air like a test. Eli realized that everything they said would be evaluated by Blackwood for information that might benefit his mysterious clients. "They're valuable," Marcus said carefully, "but we're still determining exactly how valuable." Blackwood smiled, but his attention had shifted to the DoD contractor tag in Tony's hands. "May I?" Tony reluctantly handed over the small metal plate. Blackwood examined it with the familiarity of someone who understood its significance. "This changes things considerably," he said softly. "My clients will be very interested to learn about this development." "What clients?" Emma demanded, her teenage directness cutting through the adult circumnavigation. "Who are you really representing?" Blackwood studied Emma with new attention, as if recognizing that she might be more than just a teenager with mechanical interests. "I represent people who understand that certain automotive innovations have implications beyond simple transportation, Miss Mercer. People who recognize that your great-grandfather was involved in projects that influenced modern automotive and aerospace technology." The revelation hit Eli like a physical blow. Frank hadn't just been a racing enthusiast or even an underground automotive engineer. He'd been involved in military or government research that had national security implications, which is why, Blackwood continued, "my client's offer has increased to $4 million for both vehicles and all associated documentation." $4 million. The number was so large it seemed abstract, like a lottery jackpot rather than a real possibility. But Blackwood's increased urgency, combined with the DoD contractor tag, suggested that Frank's cars represented something far more valuable than their automotive components. Tony was studying Blackwood with the suspicion of someone who'd spent decades learning to read people's motivations. And if they choose not to sell, then they'll continue to own two vehicles that may attract unwanted attention from people who are less reasonable than my clients. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Blackwood's clients weren't just collectors willing to pay premium prices for rare automobiles. They were people with the resources and motivation to acquire Frank's legacy through whatever means necessary. After Blackwood left, the garage felt contaminated by his presence. Henderson completed his appraisal in subdued silence. Tony examined the cars with new caution, and Marcus calculated financial scenarios with growing anxiety. "We're in over our heads," Marcus said finally. "This isn't about inheriting classic cars anymore. This is about inheriting whatever Frank was involved in, and we don't understand the implications." Emma had been quietly studying the racing program while the adults wrestled with the larger questions. "Dad, look at this." She pointed to a photograph in the program showing several drivers standing beside their cars. "That's great-grandpa Frank, right?" Eli confirmed the identification, but Emma's attention had shifted to the other drivers in the photograph. "This driver, the one they called Lightning, doesn't he look familiar?" Eli studied the photograph more closely. The man was younger, but there was something about his build and posture that seemed familiar. Tony leaned in to examine the photograph, and his expression changed dramatically. "That's Richard Blackwood." The realization crashed over them like a wave. Blackwood wasn't just a collector's representative who had coincidentally learned about Frank's cars. He was someone who had been directly involved in the underground racing circuit, someone who had personal knowledge of Frank's work and its significance, someone who had been searching for Frank Mercer's legacy for over 40 years. The discovery that Richard Blackwood had been personally connected to Frank's racing past transformed the garage from a place of discovery into something that felt increasingly dangerous. That evening, Eli found himself staring at the racing program photograph while Emma worked methodically through Frank's technical drawings, her engineering mind attacking the problem with systematic precision. "Look at these blueprints," she said, spreading several hand-drawn schematics across the workbench. "They're not just modifications, they're complete re-engineering of fundamental automotive systems." The blueprints showed engine components designed with tolerances that seemed impossibly tight, suspension systems that incorporated principles Eli recognized from aerospace applications, and electrical systems that appeared decades ahead of their time. But most intriguingly, several drawings included annotations in Frank's careful handwriting that referenced Project Phantom and Phase 2 implementation. Project Phantom, Eli repeated. "That matches one of the driver names from the racing program." Emma had been thinking along the same lines. What if the underground racing wasn't just about competition? What if it was testing ground for experimental technology? The possibility recontextualized everything they'd discovered. If Frank had been involved in military or government research, the racing circuit could have provided perfect cover for testing advanced automotive systems under real-world conditions. High-speed, high-stress environments would reveal flaws that laboratory testing might miss. Their investigation was interrupted by Sarah's arrival, but this time she wasn't carrying divorce papers or custody modifications. Instead, she looked worried in a way that went beyond their usual disagreements. "I've been researching Richard Blackwood," she announced without preamble. "There's something you need to know." She placed a manila folder on the workbench beside Emma's technical drawings. Inside were printed articles from automotive magazines, business journals, and what appeared to be legal documents. Blackwood isn't just a collector's representative. He owns Advanced Automotive Technologies, a company that specializes in acquiring and commercializing experimental automotive patents. Sarah's nurse training in research and attention to detail had served her well. His company has been involved in several high-profile legal battles over technology rights. Emma looked up from the blueprints with growing concern. "What kind of legal battles?" "Patent disputes, mostly. Companies claiming that AAT acquired their technology through questionable means. Several cases involved inventors who died or disappeared shortly before their patents were purchased by AAT. The implication was chilling. If Blackwood's company specialized in acquiring experimental technology, and if he'd been personally connected to Frank's racing activities in the 1960s, his interest in the garage contents went far beyond simple collector enthusiasm. Eli studied the legal documents Sarah had compiled. "These patents are worth millions?" "Some of them, but more importantly, they represent control over automotive technologies that every major manufacturer wants to license. If Frank's blueprints contain innovations that haven't been patented, they could be worth more than the cars themselves." The sound of a vehicle approaching made everyone freeze. Through the garage windows they could see headlights turning into the parking area. But instead of Blackwood's luxury sedan, a pickup truck pulled up, and Tony Carruthers emerged, carrying what appeared to be a large book. "I've been thinking about what we discovered today," he said, holding up the book as he entered. "This is a collection of automotive patents filed between 1960 and 1975. I thought you might want to see something." Tony opened the book to a section he'd marked with several sticky notes. The pages showed patent applications for automotive innovations that seemed remarkably similar to the modifications they'd found in Frank's cars. These patents were filed by various inventors, but they all share something in common. The original patent holders either died, disappeared, or sold their rights to holding companies that eventually became part of advanced automotive technologies. Emma studied the patent drawings with growing excitement. These are almost identical to Great-Grandpa's blueprints, but not exactly the same. It's like his designs were more advanced versions of these patented innovations. Tony nodded grimly. Which means Frank might have developed improvements on existing patents. Improvements that could invalidate existing licenses or be worth more than the original patents. Sarah was connecting the dots with the analytical skills that made her an excellent nurse. So if Blackwood's company controls the basic patents, but Frank developed superior versions of the same technology, it could threaten AAT's entire business model or make them incredibly valuable partners, Eli said quietly. If Frank's improvements are significant enough, the conversation was interrupted by Emma's sharp intake of breath. She'd been studying one of Frank's blueprint annotations and had noticed something the adults had missed. "Dad, look at this date." She pointed to a notation in Frank's handwriting. "This blueprint is dated 3 months ago." The revelation stopped all conversation. Frank had been in the nursing home for 6 months before his death, suffering from advancing dementia. The idea that he'd been creating technical drawings 3 months before he died suggested either that his condition had been misrepresented or that someone else had been working on his designs. Tony examined the notation with growing concern. "The handwriting looks consistent with the other documents, but you're right about the timing. Frank was barely lucid during his final months, unless he wasn't as sick as everyone believed," Sarah said slowly. "What if the dementia was exaggerated to protect him from people who were trying to find him?" The possibility opened new questions about everything they thought they knew about Frank's final years. If he'd been actively working on his automotive designs until recently, it meant the technology was current, not historical. It also meant that people like Blackwood might have been actively searching for him, not just his cars. Emma had moved to the Charger and was examining the engine bay with new focus. If Great-Grandpa was still working 3 months ago, maybe he left more recent modifications in the cars. She was right. Under closer examination, several engine components showed signs of very recent work. Tools marks were fresh, and some parts appeared to have been installed within the last year. He was still building, Eli said with growing amazement. Even in his 80s, even while everyone thought he was declining, he was still developing this technology. Tony's expression had grown increasingly serious as the implications became clear. "Eli, if Frank was still actively working on experimental automotive technology, and if Blackwood's company has been trying to acquire it, your grandfather's death might not have been as natural as everyone assumed." The accusation hung in the garage air like a toxic cloud. Sarah's medical background made her particularly sensitive to the suggestion. Frank died of heart failure in a nursing home. There was nothing suspicious about his death, but there was something suspicious about the timing, Tony replied. "Think about it. Frank maintains his secret for 40 years, works actively on advanced automotive designs, and then dies just as his technology becomes commercially viable. Just as someone like Blackwood would be most motivated to acquire it." Eli felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "What are you suggesting we do?" "I'm suggesting you understand what you've inherited before you decide what to do with it. These blueprints, these modifications, this technology, it's not just valuable, it might be revolutionary. And if I'm right about the implications, there are people who will do whatever necessary to control it. Emma had been quietly studying the most recent blueprint while the adults debated the dangers. Now she looked up with an expression that combined excitement and concern. "I think I understand what Great-Grandpa was building," she said quietly. "It's not just about making cars faster or more powerful. These modifications could change how internal combustion engines work fundamentally." She pointed to a section of the blueprint that showed fuel injection and ignition timing systems that seemed to violate conventional understanding of engine efficiency. If these calculations are correct, Great-Grandpa figured out how to increase fuel efficiency by 40% while doubling power output. This isn't just automotive technology. This could change transportation completely. Tony studied the calculations Emma had identified and his face went pale. "If this is real, it's worth more than $4 million. It's worth more than most companies." Sarah was looking between her daughter's excited face and the blueprint that represented both incredible opportunity and potentially deadly danger. "Emma, if this technology is as valuable as you think, we need to be very careful about who else learns about it." As if summoned by their conversation, headlights again appeared outside the garage. But this time, it wasn't Blackwood or any other visitor they recognized. It was a black SUV with government license plates. Two men in dark suits emerged from the vehicle and approached the garage with the purposeful stride of federal agents. The older man displayed a badge that identified him as Agent Reynolds from the Department of Defense Technology Security Division. "Mr. Mercer," Reynolds said formally, "we need to discuss your grandfather's research and its potential implications for national security." The garage, which had begun the day as a place of family discovery, had become the center of a situation that involved patent disputes, potentially revolutionary technology, and now federal government interest. Frank Mercer's legacy was proving to be far more complex and dangerous than anyone had anticipated, and Richard Blackwood was still out there, representing clients who had been searching for this technology for 40 years and were prepared to pay any price to acquire it. Agent Reynolds' appearance transformed the garage from a family inheritance dispute into a potential matter of national security. The DoD agent moved through the space with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood both the technical and political implications of what Frank Mercer had created. "Your grandfather's work was known to certain government agencies," Reynolds explained, examining the blueprints with obvious familiarity. What wasn't known was the extent of his technological developments or their current location. Emma stepped protectively closer to the technical drawings. "What does the government want with Great-Grandpa's car modifications?" "These aren't just car modifications, Miss Mercer. If the calculations in these blueprints are accurate, your great-grandfather developed engine technology that could revolutionize not just automotive transportation, but military and aerospace applications as well." Tony had been quietly studying Reynolds' credentials and demeanor. "Agent Reynolds, are you here to confiscate the cars and documentation?" "That depends entirely on the Mercer family's cooperation and their understanding of the security implications." Reynolds' tone was professional but carried an undertone that suggested non-cooperation wasn't really an option. "We need to understand what Mr. Frank Mercer accomplished during his years of private research." Sarah moved closer to Emma, her protective instincts engaging despite the agent's official authority. "What kind of security implications?" Reynolds gestured toward the blueprints that Emma had been studying. "Technology that increases fuel efficiency by 40% while doubling power output has obvious military applications. But more significantly, the engine management systems described in these documents incorporate approaches that could influence strategic defense technologies." The implications were staggering. Frank's automotive research had apparently progressed far beyond simple performance modifications into areas that affected national security. But as Reynolds continued his examination of the garage contents, something else became apparent. He wasn't discovering Frank's work for the first time. He was confirming the existence of technology the government already knew about. "You've been looking for Great-Grandpa's workshop," Emma said with sudden understanding. "This isn't a surprise to you." Reynolds paused in his examination of the Cobra's engine modifications. "Your great-grandfather maintained irregular contact with certain government agencies throughout his career. We knew he was conducting advanced research, but we didn't know where or to what extent his work had progressed." Eli found his voice, though it came out strained with the weight of the situation. "Are you saying Frank was working for the government?" "Working with, not for. Your grandfather maintained his independence, but he occasionally shared research findings that had potential defense applications. The last communication we received from him was 18 months ago. 18 months ago, Frank would have been entering the early stages of his supposed dementia. Yet according to Reynolds, he'd been lucid enough to communicate with government agencies about advanced automotive research. Tony was studying the interaction with growing suspicion. "Agent Reynolds, if the government knew Frank was conducting this research, why didn't you provide protection when people like Richard Blackwood started pursuing him?" Reynolds' expression hardened at the mention of Blackwood's name. Mr. Blackwood and his associates represent interests that are not aligned with national security. Their acquisition of this technology would not serve American strategic interests. The careful phrasing revealed more than Reynolds probably intended. The government wasn't just interested in Frank's technology. For its own applications, they were actively working to prevent it from falling into private hands that might commercialize it in ways that threatened government interests. Sarah had been processing the conversation with her characteristic analytical approach. "Agent Reynolds, are you suggesting that Frank's death wasn't natural?" "I'm suggesting that when someone possesses technology with significant strategic value, their security becomes a matter of government concern. Your grandfather understood this, which is why he took precautions to protect both his work and his family." Emma had been quietly studying one of Frank's technical drawings while the adults navigated the political implications. Now she looked up with a realization that changed everything. "The racing journal," she said suddenly. "Great-grandpa mentions a racing journal in one of his blueprint annotations. It's not just about underground racing, it's his complete research log." The mention of a racing journal galvanized everyone in the garage. If Frank had maintained detailed records of his technological development over decades, that journal would be exponentially more valuable than the blueprints they'd already discovered. Reynolds turned his full attention to Emma. "Where would your great-grandfather have kept such a journal?" Emma was already moving toward the desk where they'd initially found the racing programs. His annotations reference RJ Volume 7 and RJ Volume 12. That suggests multiple volumes over many years. She began searching through desk drawers with systematic thoroughness. But the drawers contained only routine automotive documentation and maintenance records. "No journal, no comprehensive research log. It's not here," she said with frustration. Tony had been thinking about the problem from a different angle. "Emma, if your great-grandfather was as careful about security as everyone suggests, he wouldn't keep his most valuable research in the same location as the cars. Too much risk if someone discovered the workshop, but where else would he keep it?" Eli asked. Reynolds was examining the garage space with new attention, looking for hiding places that might contain additional documentation. Mr. Mercer was trained in operational security during his military service. He would have used multiple secure locations for different aspects of his work. The mention of military service was new information that added another layer to Frank's mysterious background. Emma picked up on it immediately. "Great-grandpa was in the military." "When?" "Korean War," Reynolds replied. "He served as a combat engineer, specializing in vehicle repair and modification under field conditions. That's where he developed many of the technical skills he later applied to his automotive research." The revelation provided context for Frank's extraordinary capabilities, but it also raised new questions about his transition from military engineer to underground racer to secret researcher. Each phase of his life seemed to build upon the previous one in ways that suggested long-term planning rather than random career changes. Sarah had been studying the blueprint annotations that reference the racing journal. Some of these notes include location references. RJ7 at primary, RJ12 secured at backup location. He was definitely keeping volumes in separate places. Emma's mechanical mind was approaching the problem systematically. If he used the garage for active work but stored completed research elsewhere, where would be most secure but still accessible? Eli had been thinking about his childhood memories of Frank, trying to recall any locations where his grandfather might have maintained secret storage. He owned this property for 40 years. If he wanted secure storage, he would have built it himself, somewhere no one would think to look. Tony moved toward the garage's rear wall, studying it with new attention. The back wall of this building is deeper than it needs to be for structural support. There might be space between the inner and outer walls. Reynolds joined Tony's examination of the wall, but Emma was already testing different sections with the methodical approach of someone who understood building construction. When she pressed against a section near the corner, a panel shifted slightly. "Here," she said with excitement. The hidden panel revealed a narrow access space that contained what appeared to be a small, fireproof safe built into the building's foundation. The safe required both a key and a combination, but Emma had been paying attention to Frank's security. "Patterns. Try the dates from the racing program," she suggested. The combination from Frank's first racing victory in 1968 opened the safe, revealing its contents: 12 leather-bound journals, each labeled with dates spanning from 1965 to just 3 months before Frank's death. Reynolds reached for the journals with obvious eagerness, but Eli intercepted them. "These belong to my grandfather," he said firmly. "I think we should understand what they contain before anyone else examines them." The racing journal that Emma opened first contained far more than racing records. Frank's careful handwriting detailed not just his automotive modifications, but his observations about government interest in his work, his growing concerns about commercial exploitation of his research, and his decision to fake his death to protect both his technology and his family. The entry dated June 15, 1969. Was particularly revealing. "The racing circuit is compromised. Too many people asking questions about the modifications. Too much attention from interests that don't understand the implications. Time to disappear and continue the work in security. The boys are young enough that they'll believe the accident story. Better they grow up thinking me dead than live knowing their targets." Emma's voice was quiet as she read the entry aloud. "He faked his death to protect Dad and Uncle Marcus." The journal entry continued. "Lightning, Blackwood, is working with corporate interests that would militarize the technology without regard for consequences. Government contacts suggest national security concerns, but their approach lacks long-term vision. Must continue research independently until can identify trusted parties for continuation." Reynolds was listening to the journal entries with obvious professional interest, but something in his expression suggested the information wasn't entirely new to him. "Agent Reynolds," Sarah said with growing suspicion. "How long has the government known that Frank faked his death?" The question hung in the garage air like an accusation. Reynolds' careful silence suggested that government agencies had known far more about Frank's situation than they'd initially revealed. "Your grandfather's security was a matter of mutual concern," Reynolds finally said. "We provided certain protections in exchange for periodic research sharing." Emma looked up from the racing journal with a realization that chilled everyone present. If the government knew Great-Grandpa was alive and knew he was still researching, then someone also knew exactly when and how to find him when he became vulnerable. The implication was clear. Frank's death in the nursing home might not have been natural, and the people responsible might have had access to government information about his location and condition. Richard Blackwood's increased urgency suddenly made sense. He hadn't just discovered Frank's cars by coincidence. He'd learned that Frank was dead and that the technology was finally accessible after 40 years of protection. The racing journals revealed the full scope of Frank Mercer's 40-year deception, but they also exposed Emma's family to dangers that none of them had anticipated. As she continued reading from the most recent volume, dated just 3 months before Frank's death, the entries became increasingly urgent and paranoid. Corporate interests, escalating pressure, Emma read from an entry marked 2 weeks before Frank entered the nursing home. Blackwood's people asking questions at medical facilities. Time running out to secure final research phase. Must implement contingency protocols. Sarah looked at her daughter with growing concern. Emma, maybe you should stop reading those entries aloud. If Agent Reynolds is recording this conversation... I'm not recording anything, Reynolds interrupted. But Miss Mercer is right to be concerned about the timeline. Your grandfather's final entries suggest he was aware of immediate threats to his security. Eli had been studying the technical drawings while Emma read from the journals, trying to understand the engineering principles that had made his grandfather so valuable and so dangerous. These modifications aren't just about engine performance. They're about fundamental changes to how internal combustion works. Tony moved to examine the drawings Eli was studying. Show me what you're seeing. Look at this fuel injection system. Instead of traditional timing, Frank designed a dynamic system that adjusts injection and ignition based on real-time combustion analysis. But the sensors required for this level of precision don't exist, Tony finished, or didn't exist when he was designing this. Emma looked up from the journal with excitement. But they do exist now. Great-grandpa's final entries talk about sensor technology finally catching up to theoretical applications. He wasn't just designing advanced engines. He was designing them for technology that was still being developed. The implications were staggering. Frank hadn't just been ahead of his time in the 1960s. He'd been designing automotive systems for capabilities that were only becoming available in the 2020s. His research represented a 40-year head start on automotive technology that was just becoming commercially viable. Reynolds was studying the conversation with obvious interest, but something in his demeanor suggested he was also calculating political implications that went beyond technical innovation. Your grandfather's timing was remarkable, he said carefully. His research is becoming practically applicable, just as global automotive manufacturers are under pressure to develop more efficient, lower-emission vehicles. Sarah had been thinking about the family implications while the others focused on technical details. Emma, I want you to think carefully about what we're getting involved in. This isn't just about understanding family history anymore. This is about technology that people have killed for. Mom, we don't know that anyone killed Great-Grandpa. We don't know that anyone didn't, Sarah replied firmly. And now we're sitting in a garage with federal agents and people like Richard Blackwood showing up with millions of dollars in offers. This isn't safe. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple vehicles arriving outside. Through the garage windows, they could see 3 black SUVs with government plates, but also Richard Blackwood's luxury sedan and what appeared to be several other civilian vehicles. Reynolds immediately moved toward the garage entrance, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Mr. Mercer, I'm going to need your family to stay inside while I assess the situation. But before Reynolds could reach the entrance, Blackwood appeared in the doorway, accompanied by 2 men in expensive suits and a woman carrying what appeared to be legal documentation. Agent Reynolds, Blackwood said with the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. I believe there's been some confusion about jurisdiction here. Reynolds' expression hardened. Mr. Blackwood, this is a federal investigation involving potential national security issues. You have no authority here? Actually, I do. The woman with legal documents stepped forward, revealing credentials that identified her as Janet Morrison, Attorney General's office. Mr. Blackwood's company holds provisional patents on technology that appears to be related to Mr. Mercer's research. We're here to resolve questions of intellectual property rights. Emma clutched the racing journal protectively, realizing that the legal battle might be more dangerous than the technical implications. These are my great-grandfather's private papers. No one has the right to take them. Morrison studied Emma with the calculating gaze of someone who understood that teenagers could complicate legal proceedings in unpredictable ways. Miss Mercer, intellectual property law is complex. If your great-grandfather developed technology that builds upon existing patents, the ownership questions become very complicated. Eli found his voice, though it emerged strained with the weight of protecting his family while navigating forces he didn't understand. What exactly are you claiming ownership of? Blackwood moved toward the cars and technical drawings with obvious familiarity. Your grandfather's engine management systems appear to incorporate elements of patents that my company acquired from other inventors over the past 30 years. If Frank developed improvements on those patented technologies, the improvements may belong to the patent holders. Tony had been quietly studying Morrison's credentials and the legal documents she carried. That's not how patent law works. Improvements on existing patents don't automatically belong to the original patent holders. Unless, Morrison replied smoothly, the improvements were developed using research that was originally funded by the patent holders. Or if the original inventor signed agreements that assigned future developments to corporate partners. Emma was listening to the legal maneuvering while scanning through Frank's journal entries, looking for any reference to corporate agreements or patent assignments. What she found was worse than corporate ownership claims. A great-grandpa wrote about something called technology transfer agreements with government contractors, she said. Reading from entries dated in the 1970s, he mentioned signing documents that gave certain rights to his research to support national defense. Applications. Reynolds and Morrison exchanged glances that suggested Emma had discovered information that complicated everyone's legal positions. Miss Mercer, Reynolds said carefully, if your grandfather signed technology transfer agreements with defense contractors, the ownership of his research becomes a matter of federal jurisdiction, not private patent disputes. Blackwood's confident demeanor faltered slightly. Agent Reynolds, my company's patents predate any government agreements. Private intellectual property rights supersede subsequent federal claims. Not when national security is involved, Morrison replied, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely confident in the government's legal position. Sarah had been watching the legal and political maneuvering with growing alarm. Stop, all of you stop. Emma, give me that journal. Emma reluctantly handed the racing journal to her mother, who closed it firmly and held it against her chest like a shield. This is my family's inheritance, Sarah said with quiet determination. My daughter's great-grandfather left these materials to her father, and until a court determines otherwise, they belong to us. Agent Reynolds, unless you have a warrant, I'm asking you to leave. Mr. Blackwood, unless you have a court order, I'm asking you to leave. Ms. Morrison, if the Attorney General's office has legal claims, they can file them through proper channels. The garage fell silent as Sarah's unexpected assertiveness shifted the power dynamic. Reynolds clearly wanted to argue federal authority, Morrison was calculating legal strategies, and Blackwood was evaluating whether his corporate pressure tactics would work against a protective mother. Emma stared at her mother with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Sarah had never shown interest in automotive technology, had often criticized Eli's mechanical pursuits, and had spent 2 years trying to minimize Emma's time in garages. But when her daughter's inheritance was threatened, she'd become formidable. Mrs. Mercer, Morrison said diplomatically, I understand your protective instincts, but this technology represents millions of dollars in potential commercial applications. The legal questions need to be resolved. Then resolve them in court, Sarah replied. But until then, my family will secure Frank's materials and make our own decisions about what to do with them. Blackwood tried a different approach. Sarah, may I call you Sarah? I understand this is overwhelming, but my client's offer stands. $4 million for the vehicles and documentation. You could resolve all these legal complications and secure your family's financial future. Your clients, Emma said with sudden insight. are the same corporate interests that Great-Grandpa spent 40 years hiding from. That's why you recognize the technology. That's why you knew exactly where to find us. The accusation hung in the garage air like an indictment. Blackwood's expression confirmed Emma's suspicion. He wasn't just a collector's representative who had coincidentally discovered Frank's cars. He was part of the corporate conspiracy that Frank had faked his death to escape. Reynolds was studying the interaction with professional interest, apparently realizing that the federal government's position might be stronger if private corporate interests were eliminated from the equation. "Mr. Blackwood," he said formally, "if your company's pursuit of this technology contributed to threats against Mr. Frank Mercer's security, that becomes a federal matter involving protection of defense-related research." Morrison was also recalculating her position as the legal landscape shifted. "Agent Reynolds, if there are questions about Mr. Blackwood's company's conduct, the Attorney General's office will need to review our representation." The adult power struggle was evolving rapidly, but Emma was focused on a different problem. While the lawyers and agents argued jurisdiction, she'd been studying the garage space and had noticed something troubling. "Dad," she said quietly, "look at the floor near the workbench." Eli followed Emma's gaze and saw what she'd observed. Fresh tool marks in the concrete floor, as if someone had recently used heavy equipment to search beneath the garage foundation. "Someone's already been here," he said with growing alarm. "Someone's been digging." The realization that the garage had been compromised by unknown parties shifted everyone's attention from legal arguments to immediate security concerns. If someone had already searched the property, it meant Frank's precautions might have been insufficient to protect his most valuable research. And it meant that the people currently arguing over ownership might not be the only ones who knew about Frank Mercer's revolutionary automotive technology. The discovery that someone had already searched beneath the garage floor transformed the legal and political arguments into secondary concerns. Emma knelt beside the tool marks, her mechanical training allowing her to interpret what she was seeing with disturbing clarity. "These marks are recent," she announced, running her fingers along the concrete scratches. "Someone used professional excavation equipment, probably within the last few weeks." Agent Reynolds immediately moved to examine the evidence, his federal training engaging as he realized the security implications. "Mr. Mercer, have you noticed any signs of unauthorized access to the property?" Eli shook his head, but Tony was studying the excavation marks with growing concern. "Those aren't random search patterns. Someone knew exactly where to dig." Emma stood up, her face pale with a realization that chilled everyone present. What if Great-Grandpa didn't die of natural causes? What if someone found him first? The possibility hung in the garage air like a toxic cloud. Sarah instinctively moved closer to her daughter, her protective instincts fully engaged, despite her limited understanding of the technical and political forces they were confronting. Blackwood was studying the excavation, evidence with an expression that suggested he wasn't entirely surprised by the discovery. "Agent Reynolds, if someone else has already acquired Frank's research, this entire discussion becomes academic. Unless," Morrison added, "the search was unsuccessful, and Frank's most valuable work is still hidden somewhere on the property." Emma had been thinking about the problem from Frank's perspective, trying to understand how a man who'd successfully hidden his identity for 40 years would protect his most important discoveries. "The racing journals mention final phase contingency protocols," she said, moving toward the safe where they'd discovered the journals. Great-Grandpa was too smart to put everything in one location. She began examining the other contents of the safe, materials they'd overlooked in the excitement of finding the journals. Beneath the 12 leather volumes was a manila envelope marked, "In case of discovery." Emma opened the envelope with trembling hands, revealing documents that would change everything they thought they knew about Frank Mercer's death and the value of his automotive research. The first document was a death certificate, Frank Mercer's real death certificate, dated 6 months before his supposed death in the nursing home. According to the medical examiner's report, Frank had died of cardiac arrest in his workshop, apparently while working on final modifications to the Charger's engine system. "He's been dead for 6 months longer than we thought," Sarah whispered, her medical training helping her interpret the official documentation. But the second document was even more shocking, a letter in Frank's handwriting, dated the day before his actual death, explaining the elaborate deception he'd arranged to protect his family and his research. Emma read the letter aloud with a voice that shook with emotion. "If you're reading this, then someone has discovered my workshop and learned the truth about my death. The man who died in the nursing home was my brother Robert, who agreed to take my place to give me time to complete the final research phase. Robert had terminal cancer and volunteered to spend his remaining weeks maintaining the fiction that Frank Mercer was declining from dementia." The revelation hit everyone in the garage like a physical blow. Frank hadn't died in the nursing home. His brother Robert had died there, pretending to be Frank, while Frank himself had died months earlier in the garage, where they now stood. Robert Mercer was great-grandpa's twin brother. Emma continued reading. They'd maintained the deception since 1969, with Robert living Frank's public life, while Frank continued his research in secret. When Frank died of his heart attack, Robert took his place in the nursing home to protect the family from discovering the truth too quickly. Agent Reynolds was studying the death certificates with professional attention to detail. This explains the government's confusion about Frank's condition and capabilities. "We were monitoring Robert, not Frank." Blackwood had gone pale as he realized the implications. "If Frank died 6 months ago, then someone else excavated this garage. Someone who knew about the research and had access to the property." Emma was still reading from Frank's final letter. "The technology I've developed represents both incredible opportunity and terrible danger. The engine modifications can revolutionize transportation, but they can also be weaponized in ways that would destabilize global energy markets. I've hidden the complete research in 3 locations, with instructions for assembly only if my inheritors prove worthy of the responsibility." Tony leaned forward with growing excitement. 3 locations? "We've only found the garage and these journals." Emma turned to the final page of Frank's letter, where a hand-drawn map showed the garage property and 2 additional locations marked as Archive A and Archive B. "One location is the basement of Great-Grandpa's house," she said, studying the map. "The other is marked as Industrial Storage Unit 247, with an address across town." Morrison was calculating the legal implications of the discovery. If Frank died 6 months ago, and if his research is distributed across multiple locations, the ownership questions become exponentially more complex. But Sarah was focused on a different aspect of the revelation. "Emma, if your great-grandfather and his brother maintained this deception for over 50 years, how many people knew the truth?" Emma found the answer in Frank's letter. Only 3 people knew about Robert's substitution: Frank's government contact, Agent J. Reynolds, his medical provider, Dr. Patricia Manning at County General, and his automotive supplier, Tony Carruthers, at Classic Auto Restoration. The garage fell silent as everyone processed the implication that Tony and Agent Reynolds had been part of Frank's deception for decades, maintaining the fiction that allowed Frank to continue his research while the world believed him to be a reclusive old man, declining into dementia. Eli stared at Tony with a mixture of betrayal and understanding. "You knew. All these years, you knew Frank was still alive and working." Tony's expression was heavy with the weight of secrets he'd carried for decades. "Frank swore me to secrecy, and I could see the dangers he was trying to protect you from. When he died 6 months ago, I thought the secret would die with him." Reynolds was also acknowledging his role in the deception. "The government provided limited protection and medical support in exchange for periodic access to Frank's research findings. We weren't prepared for him to die before completing the technology transfer." Emma was studying the final section of Frank's letter with growing concern. "There's more. Great-grandpa writes about someone called the Collector, who had been searching for his research for decades. Someone who had tracked down and eliminated other automotive inventors who'd developed competing technologies. Blackwood's face had gone white as Emma read the description of the Collector. Someone who acquired revolutionary automotive patents by any means necessary, including threats, coercion, and elimination of inventors who refused to sell their innovations. According to Great-grandpa's letter, Emma continued, the Collector had been systematically acquiring patents for advanced engine technologies since the 1970s, building a monopoly on automotive innovations that could threaten traditional energy industries. Sarah was connecting the dots with growing alarm. Emma, if this Collector person killed other inventors, and if they discovered Frank's location, then Robert's death in the nursing home wasn't natural either, Emma finished. Someone poisoned him thinking they were killing Great-grandpa Frank. The realization that both brothers had been murdered transformed the garage from a place of discovery into a crime scene. Agent Reynolds immediately began treating the situation as a federal investigation, while Morrison started calculating the legal implications of inherited technology that might have been acquired through multiple homicides. But Emma was focused on the most immediate danger suggested by Frank's letter. If the Collector had killed Frank and Robert, and if they'd already searched the garage property, the only reason Emma's family was still alive was because they hadn't yet found the complete research archive. Dad, she said quietly, studying the map Frank had left them, we need to get to those other locations before whoever killed Great-grandpa figures out that we have this information. As if summoned by her words, the sound of vehicles approaching made everyone in the garage freeze. Through the windows, they could see several black sedans with tinted windows, moving with the coordinated precision of a professional operation. The Collector had found them. Agent Reynolds was processing the implications with growing concern. If Frank designed security measures that require family participation, the federal government's ability to acquire his research becomes complicated. Blackwood had been listening to the conversation with obvious calculation. Director Walsh, if the Mercer family controls access to Frank's archive, perhaps we could arrange a collaborative agreement. My company's resources combined with federal protection could provide optimal conditions for developing the technology. Emma looked at Blackwood with the direct gaze that cut through adult diplomatic language. You mean you want to use federal protection to get access to a technology you've been murdering people to steal for 30 years? The accusation silenced the garage as everyone processed Emma's blunt assessment of Blackwood's motivations. Walsh was studying Blackwood's response with obvious professional interest. Mr. Blackwood, Miss Mercer's characterization of your company's acquisition methods raises questions about your suitability as a collaborative partner. Before Blackwood could respond, the sound of additional vehicles approaching made everyone turn toward the garage entrance. Through the windows, they could see what appeared to be local law enforcement vehicles. But their coordinated arrival suggested this wasn't a routine police response. Tony moved toward the window with growing alarm. Those aren't county sheriff vehicles. The markings are wrong. Emma joined Tony at the window, her sharp eyes picking up details the adults had missed. The license plates are government issue, but the vehicle configurations look more like military transport than law enforcement. Director Walsh was already communicating with her security team through discreet radio communications. Her expression suggested that the new arrivals weren't part of her operation. Agent Reynolds, did you call for additional federal support? Reynolds was also studying the approaching vehicles with concern. No additional support was requested. Those vehicles aren't from my agency. The realization that unknown parties were surrounding the garage shifted everyone's attention from negotiation to immediate security concerns. Sarah instinctively moved closer to Emma, while Tony and Eli positioned themselves near the cars that might provide protective cover. Emma was studying Frank's letter with renewed urgency, looking for information about security protocols that might help them understand what they were facing. Great-grandpa mentions hostile acquisition protocols in his final notes, she said, reading quickly. He writes about contingency plans if corporate or government interests attempted to seize his research through force. Walsh was coordinating defensive positions with her security team while processing Emma's discovery. Miss Mercer, what kind of contingency plans? Emma found the relevant section and read aloud, if hostile parties attempt forcible acquisition of research materials, activation of archive location C will become available to family members who demonstrate commitment to protecting the technology from exploitation. Location C contains not just research data, but evidence of corporate and government crimes that could expose the entire conspiracy. The revelation that Frank had compiled evidence against his pursuers transformed the situation from a research acquisition into a potential exposure of decades of criminal activity. Everyone in the garage realized that Frank's final archive might contain information that could destroy both corporate conspiracies and corrupt government operations. Tony was the first to understand why unknown parties were surrounding them. Frank didn't just hide his automotive research. He documented everyone who'd been trying to steal it, including evidence of murders, corporate corruption, and government complicity. Emma was still reading from Frank's final security protocols. Archive location C becomes accessible only when family members are under immediate threat, and only if they demonstrate willingness to expose the complete truth, regardless of personal consequences. Director Walsh was studying Emma with growing respect and concern. Miss Mercer, if your great-grandfather compiled evidence against government operations, cooperation with federal agencies becomes complicated for your family. Sarah had been following the conversation with growing understanding of the impossible choices her family faced. Emma, your great-grandfather put us in a position where we have to choose between protecting his technology and protecting ourselves. No, Mom, Emma replied with sudden clarity. He put us in a position where we have to choose between being victims of the conspiracy or being the people who expose it. The approaching vehicles had stopped outside the garage, and armed personnel were beginning to establish positions around the building. Through the windows, they could see that these weren't law enforcement officers or federal agents, but private security personnel with military-grade equipment. Emma looked around the garage at the adults who'd been arguing over her great-grandfather's legacy and made a decision that would determine not just her family's future, but the future of revolutionary automotive technology that could change the world. I know where archive location C is, she announced, and I know how to access it. But I'm only going to do it if everyone in this garage agrees to work together to expose the complete truth about what's been happening. The sound of vehicles' doors slamming and coordinated footsteps approaching the garage entrance made everyone realize that their time for negotiation was ending. Whatever decision they made about Frank's final archive would have to be made in the next few minutes, before the unknown armed personnel outside decided to take control of the situation by force. Emma clutched her great-grandfather's letter and looked at her family, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether Frank Mercer's 40-year sacrifice to protect his technology and his family would succeed or fail. Emma's declaration that she knew the location of Archive C galvanized everyone in the garage. But before anyone could respond, the sound of coordinated movement outside made it clear that their time for discussion had ended. The unknown armed personnel were positioning themselves around the building with military precision. Director Walsh immediately took command of the defensive situation. Everyone moved to the center of the garage, away from windows and entrances. My security team will establish a perimeter. But Emma was studying Frank's letter with intense focus, her mechanical mind working through the security protocols her great-grandfather had designed. Director Walsh, the people outside aren't here to steal the research. They're here to destroy it. Walsh paused in her tactical coordination. What makes you think that? Emma pointed to a section of Frank's letter she'd overlooked earlier. Great-grandpa writes about scorched earth protocols designed by corporate interests who would rather destroy revolutionary technology than allow it to be developed by competitors. If they can't control the automotive innovations, they'll eliminate them completely. The implication was chilling. The armed personnel surrounding the garage weren't trying to acquire Frank's research for their own use. They were trying to eliminate it to protect existing corporate interests that would be threatened by revolutionary automotive technology. Tony was studying the vehicles outside with growing alarm. Those looked like private military contractors, not corporate security. Someone with serious resources is trying to end this permanently. Sarah moved protectively closer to Emma, her maternal instincts fully engaged despite her limited understanding of the technical and political forces they were confronting. Emma, if they're here to destroy everything, what does your great-grandfather's letter say about protecting the research? Emma was scanning through Frank's security protocols with urgent efficiency. Archive Location C isn't just evidence storage. It's a complete backup of all his research, plus automated systems for releasing the information to media and government agencies if the primary archives are compromised. Agent Reynolds was coordinating with Director Walsh's security team while processing the implications of Emma's discovery. Miss Mercer, if your great-grandfather designed dead man switches into his archive system, activation of those protocols could expose information that affects ongoing federal investigations and could save lives by preventing the destruction of technology that could revolutionize transportation and reduce global dependence on fossil fuels. Emma replied with the direct honesty that cut through adult political considerations. The sound of amplified voices outside interrupted their conversation. Someone with a bullhorn was making announcements that confirmed Emma's assessment of the situation. Attention occupants of the garage facility. You are harboring materials that represent threats to national economic security. You have 10 minutes to evacuate the building before we implement containment protocols. Emma looked around at the adults who'd been arguing over her great-grandfather's legacy and realized that Frank's final test was happening, exactly as he'd designed it. Under pressure, with limited time and facing genuine danger, the people who claimed interest in his work would have to demonstrate their true priorities. Archive Location C requires specific activation codes that are hidden in different locations throughout this garage, she announced. But accessing those codes requires collaborative effort from people who've demonstrated commitment to protecting the technology rather than exploiting it. Director Walsh was studying Emma with growing respect. Miss Mercer, what kind of collaborative effort? Emma had been thinking about Frank's personality and his 4 decades of careful planning. Great-grandpa was an engineer who believed in practical problem-solving over theoretical discussion. The activation codes are probably hidden in places that require mechanical knowledge, family history, and understanding of his values to locate. Tony moved toward Frank's workbench with obvious familiarity. Emma, your great-grandfather showed me some of his security mechanisms over the years. He liked to hide important things in places that looked ordinary but required specific technical knowledge to access. Emma joined Tony at the workbench, her eyes scanning the familiar tools and equipment with new focus. The letter mentions activation codes hidden within the tools of the trade. Maybe he built the codes into his actual equipment. As Emma and Tony began systematically examining Frank's tools, Sarah found herself in the unexpected position of coordinating with Director Walsh and Agent Reynolds to buy them time against the hostile forces outside. How long can your security team hold a defensive position? Sarah asked Walsh with the practical directness of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations in medical settings. Walsh was evaluating tactical options while monitoring her team's communications. My people are outnumbered, but we have federal authority and better training. However, if the opposing force is willing to use lethal measures, our options become limited. Agent Reynolds was also calculating strategic possibilities. Director Walsh, if we can document that private military contractors are attempting to destroy federally protected research, That becomes grounds for expanded federal response. Emma looked up from her examination of Frank's tools with a realization that changed their tactical situation. Everyone's assuming we need to defend this location until we can access Archive C. But Great-Grandpa's security protocols are designed around mobility, not static defense. She held up a modified wrench that had seemed ordinary until she'd examined its weight distribution and discovered hidden compartments. This tool contains the first activation code, but also GPS coordinates for a mobile access point. Archive Location C isn't a fixed storage facility. It's a mobile system that moves to different locations based on security conditions. Tony was studying the modified tool with growing amazement. Frank built his final archive into a vehicle, something that could be moved, if any. Of his storage locations were compromised. Emma was working through the logic of Frank's security design with the systematic approach he taught her to use for mechanical problems. The mobile archive would need to be something that looked ordinary, something that could be hidden in plain sight, and something that had the mechanical capacity to house sophisticated electronic systems. As she spoke, her gaze moved toward the two classic cars that had been the center of all their attention. The 1967 Shelby Cobra and the 1969 Dodge Charger weren't just restored vehicles with advanced modifications. They were Frank's mobile research archive, designed to protect his life's work by hiding it within automotive masterpieces that no one would think to examine for data storage capabilities. The cars, she said with sudden certainty. Great-Grandpa didn't just modify them for performance. He turned them into mobile data storage and transmission systems. Archive Location C is right here in this garage. The realization that they'd been standing next to Frank's complete research archive for days shifted everyone's tactical calculations. Director Walsh immediately began revising defensive plans while Agent Reynolds calculated the federal implications of protecting mobile research platforms, but Emma was focused on a more immediate problem revealed by Frank's letter. The mobile archive system has defensive capabilities designed to protect the research if hostile forces attempt acquisition. But activating those defenses requires family authorization and understanding of Great-Grandpa's final priorities. Sarah looked at her daughter with growing concern. Emma, what kind of defensive capabilities? Emma was reading from the final section of Frank's letter, her voice quiet as she processed the implications. The cars are equipped with automated systems that can eliminate threats to the research, but only if family members demonstrate understanding that protecting the technology is more important than protecting themselves. The ultimatum Frank had built into his final security protocols was both brilliant and terrifying. To access his complete research archive and activate its defensive capabilities, Emma's family would have to prove they were willing to risk their own lives to prevent the technology from being destroyed or acquired by corporate interests that had murdered Frank and 17 other inventors outside the garage. The 10-minute deadline was approaching, and the hostile forces were positioning themselves for what appeared to be a coordinated assault on the building. Emma looked around at the adults who'd spent days arguing over her great-grandfather's legacy and realized that Frank's final test had brought them to the moment of truth. They would either work together to protect revolutionary automotive technology that could change the world, or they would watch as 40 years of Frank Mercer's work was destroyed by the same corporate conspiracy that had murdered him. Emma's discovery that the classic cars contained Frank's mobile research archive shifted the tactical situation from defensive to offensive. As the 10-minute deadline approached, she was working frantically with Tony to activate systems that had been hidden within automotive masterpieces for decades. The Cobra's dashboard has components that aren't standard, Tony observed, examining the interior with new understanding. These gauges have digital displays integrated into analog designs. Emma was studying Frank's activation instructions while trying to understand systems that represented 40 years of secret engineering. The first authorization code has to be entered through the Cobra's ignition sequence, but in a specific pattern that demonstrates mechanical knowledge. She began following Frank's instructions, turning the ignition key in a sequence that was part automotive startup and part computer login. As the engine came alive, additional displays emerged from what had appeared to be standard dashboard components. Archive C Online appeared on a screen that materialized from beneath the speedometer. Awaiting family authorization protocols? Emma looked around at her family and the government agents who'd been arguing over Frank's legacy. Great-grandpa's system requires voice authorization from multiple family members, plus confirmation that we understand the consequences of activation. Sarah moved toward the car with obvious concern. Emma, what are the consequences? Emma was reading from the final section of Frank's instructions. Activating the defensive systems will expose the complete conspiracy, including evidence of government complicity. It will also release all the automotive technology innovations to public domain, preventing any corporate or government control over the research. Director Walsh immediately understood the implications. Miss Mercer releasing classified automotive research to public domain would have national security consequences. And keeping it secret has had human rights consequences, Emma replied with her characteristic directness. Great-grandpa documented 17 murders committed to control this technology. How many more people will die if it remains hidden? The sound of movement outside made everyone realize their time for debate was ending. The hostile forces were beginning their approach to the garage, and whatever decision they made about Frank's final archive would have to be made. Immediately, Agent Reynolds was coordinating with Director Walsh's security team while processing the political implications of Emma's choice. Director Walsh, if we allow Miss Mercer to activate her great-grandfather's systems, we're potentially exposing federal operations that have been classified for decades. And if we don't, Emma interrupted, we're letting the same corporate conspiracy that murdered great-grandpa destroy technology that could reduce global dependence on fossil fuels and revolutionize transportation. Eli found his voice, though it emerged strained with the weight of making decisions that would affect not just his family, but potentially the world. Emma, this is bigger than any of us can fully understand. Are you certain about what you're choosing? Emma looked at her father with the calm certainty that had been building throughout their investigation of Frank's legacy. Dad, you've spent your whole life being told you're not good enough, not successful enough, not important enough. Great-grandpa left you this inheritance because he knew you'd understand that some things are more important than safety or money or what other people think. Sarah was watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and terror. Emma, once you activate those systems, there's no going back. You'll be exposing people and organizations with the power to destroy our family. Mum, they've already destroyed our family. The divorce, the custody battles, the constant worry about money, all of that happened because Dad was never given a chance to prove what he could accomplish. Great-grandpa's technology isn't just about cars. It's about people like Dad finally getting recognition for what they understand. The sound of the garage door being forced interrupted Emma's explanation. The hostile forces had begun their assault on the building, using equipment that suggested they were prepared to overcome any defensive measures except the ones they didn't know existed. Emma turned to the Cobra's authorization system and began speaking the family confirmation, codes that Frank had embedded in his security protocols. Emma Mercer, granddaughter of Eli Mercer, great-granddaughter of Frank Mercer, authorizing Archive C activation for protection of technological innovation and exposure of corporate conspiracy. The car's systems responded immediately. Displays throughout both vehicles coming online with 40 years of research data, evidence files, and automated communication protocols that began transmitting Frank's complete archive to media organizations, government agencies, and academic institutions worldwide. But the defensive systems that Frank had built into his mobile archive were more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated. As the hostile forces breached the garage entrances, both classic cars began operating independently. their modified engines producing sounds that no conventional automotive systems should have been capable of making. "Everyone get behind the workbench," Tony shouted, recognizing that Frank's defensive protocols involved capabilities that went far beyond simple data transmission. The Cobra and Charger began moving without drivers, their automated systems engaging threat assessment and response protocols that Frank had designed specifically for the situation they now faced. The vehicles positioned themselves between the hostile forces and the people they were programmed to protect. Director Walsh was coordinating her security response while trying to understand automotive defensive systems that exceeded anything she'd encountered in decades of federal service. "Miss Mercer, what exactly did your great-grandfather build into these vehicles?" Emma was monitoring the archive system's status displays while trying to stay out of the way of cars that were operating with artificial intelligence Frank had developed decades before such technology became commercially available. Non-lethal defensive capabilities designed to incapacitate threats while protecting civilian personnel and preserving evidence of corporate conspiracy. The hostile forces who had entered the garage, expecting to face conventional resistance, found themselves confronting automated automotive systems that moved with precision and capability that defied understanding. The vehicles used modified exhaust systems to deploy disorienting sonic effects, advanced suspension systems to create barriers and obstacles, and electronic systems to disrupt the attackers' communication equipment. Within minutes, the corporate military contractors who had been sent to destroy Frank's research found themselves overwhelmed by defensive technologies they hadn't anticipated and couldn't counter effectively. Agent Reynolds was documenting the confrontation while coordinating with federal backup that was finally beginning to arrive. Director Walsh, Miss Mercer's great-grandfather, appears to have developed autonomous vehicle capabilities that are decades ahead of current technology. Emma was watching Frank's automotive masterpieces defend his life's work with a mixture of pride and amazement. Great-grandpa spent 40 years preparing for this moment. He knew that corporate interests would eventually try to destroy his research, and he built systems to protect it that no one could anticipate or counter. As federal reinforcements secured the garage and began processing the corporate personnel who had attempted to destroy Frank's archive, Emma realized that her great-grandfather's final test had been passed. By choosing to activate his defensive systems despite the personal risks, her family had demonstrated the commitment to technological innovation and social responsibility that Frank had hoped to find in his inheritors. The museum authentication certificate that would eventually be issued for Frank's automotive achievements would recognize not just the technical innovations he'd accomplished, but the courage and integrity he'd demonstrated in protecting those innovations from exploitation while ensuring they would ultimately benefit humanity rather than corporate interests. Emma looked around the garage at the adults who'd spent days arguing over her great-grandfather's legacy and realized that Frank's true gift hadn't been the cars or the technology or even the evidence that would expose decades of corporate conspiracy. His true gift had been the opportunity for her family to prove they were worthy of something more significant than anyone had ever believed possible. 6 months after the confrontation at Frank's garage, Eli stood outside the newly renovated building that now housed Mercer and Daughter Restoration, watching Emma install the workshop sign that represented everything their family had discovered about themselves and each other. The morning sun illuminated painted letters that proclaimed their shared commitment to automotive excellence and technological innovation. The federal investigation that followed Frank's archive activation had exposed corporate conspiracy spanning 3 decades, resulting in criminal charges against advanced automotive technologies and dozens of associated companies. Richard Blackwood was serving a federal sentence for conspiracy to commit murder, while the technological innovations that Frank had protected were being developed through a partnership between the Mercer Family Foundation and university research programs worldwide. Dad, "The museum representative is here," Emma called from where she was adjusting the sign's positioning. At 17, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd helped expose international conspiracy and revolutionize automotive technology. But more importantly, she carried herself with the security of someone who'd never again doubt her father's capabilities or her family's worth. The Smithsonian curator who emerged from the sedan was Dr. Patricia Harrison, an automotive historian whose expertise had been crucial in authenticating Frank's innovations and establishing their historical significance. The 1967 Shelby Cobra would become the centerpiece of an exhibition about American automotive innovation, while the 1969 Dodge Charger would remain with the Mercer family as both working research platform and symbol of generational legacy. "Mr. Mercer," Dr. Harrison said warmly, "the museum board has approved the final details of the Frank Mercer Technology Legacy Exhibition. Your grandfather's story will inspire young people for generations." Eli accepted the curator's handshake with hands that no longer shook with uncertainty. The past 6 months had transformed him from a struggling mechanic who felt like a family disappointment into a recognized expert in advanced automotive systems, sought after by manufacturers and research institutions worldwide. Sarah arrived carrying coffee and wearing the expression of someone whose perspective had been fundamentally changed by witnessing her family's courage and capability under impossible circumstances. The custody disputes had been resolved when she'd realized that Emma's mechanical education with her father represented preparation for a career that could influence global transportation technology. The insurance settlement cleared, she announced, settling into one of the chairs they'd arranged in the garage's office area. The federal compensation for Frank's research licensing will cover Emma's college expenses and establish the family foundation with enough resources to continue his work. Emma looked up from the engine she was modifying, her face bright with the joy of someone who'd found her calling and been supported in pursuing it. "Mom, Dr. Patterson from MIT called. The automotive engineering program wants to establish a Frank Mercer scholarship for students who demonstrate both technical innovation and ethical commitment to social responsibility." The scholarship program represented recognition that Frank's legacy extended beyond technological innovation into questions of how advanced capabilities should be developed and applied. Emma would be the first recipient, but the program was designed to identify and support young people who combined technical excellence with commitment to using their capabilities for broader social benefit. Tony arrived, carrying parts they'd ordered for their current restoration project, his face showing the satisfaction of someone who'd spent decades protecting important secrets and finally been able to reveal the truth. "The prototype engine testing is complete. Frank's efficiency improvements work exactly as his calculations predicted. The engine modifications that Frank had developed were being manufactured under licenses that generated revenue for automotive innovation research, while ensuring the technology remained available to manufacturers worldwide, rather than being controlled by corporate monopolies." Uncle Marcus appeared in the doorway, carrying legal documents and wearing an expression that mixed embarrassment with genuine respect. "Eli, the final patent filings are complete. The Mercer family holds licensing rights to 13 revolutionary automotive technologies that are projected to generate millions in annual revenue." Emma grinned at her uncle, with the good-natured teasing that had replaced family tensions. "Uncle Marcus, are you admitting that Dad inherited something valuable instead of complete garbage?" Marcus had the grace to look embarrassed about his earlier dismissals. "Emma, I'm admitting that your father understood something about your great-grandfather that the rest of us missed. Frank didn't leave you cars. He left you an opportunity to prove that the Mercer family was worthy of something extraordinary." Agent Reynolds arrived for his regular consultation about the ongoing investigation, but his relationship with the family had evolved from official oversight to genuine friendship. "Miss Mercer, the international Automotive Safety Council wants to discuss implementing Frank's efficiency technologies in developing nations where fuel costs represent significant economic barriers. Emma's eyes lit up with excitement about applications that could improve lives worldwide. Agent Reynolds' great-grandpa's journal entries show he was particularly interested in technologies that could reduce transportation costs for people in rural communities. I think he'd be proud to know his work was helping people who face the same economic challenges his own family experienced. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure. Director Walsh emerged from a government sedan with the purposeful stride that had once seemed threatening but now represented partnership in continuing Frank's work under appropriate security oversight. Miss Mercer, Walsh said formally, but with obvious warmth, the Department of Energy has approved funding for the Mercer Foundation's research into sustainable transportation technologies. Your great-grandfather's innovations are becoming the foundation for next-generation automotive systems that could transform global energy consumption. Emma looked around at the adults who had gathered in the garage that had once been dismissed as worthless inheritance. Federal agents, museum curators, family members, and automotive experts were collaborating on projects that could influence transportation technology worldwide. All because a 16-year-old girl had been willing to trust her great-grandfather's belief that some things were more important than personal safety. There's something else, Director Walsh continued. The International Patents Office has completed their review of Frank's complete research archive. His innovations represent the most significant advancement in internal combustion efficiency achieved in the past century. Universities worldwide are requesting access to his research methodologies. Eli found himself looking at the photograph of Frank Mercer that now hung prominently on the garage wall, not the reclusive old man the family had known, but the young automotive innovator whose courage and sacrifice had protected revolutionary technology for decades. Frank's true gift hadn't been the cars or the research or even the financial security his legacy provided. His gift had been the opportunity for his family to discover that they were capable of far more than anyone had ever believed. Emma stood in the center of the garage, surrounded by evidence of her great-grandfather's extraordinary life and her family's transformation from disappointment to recognition. The workshop sign outside proclaimed Mercer and Daughter Restoration, but everyone who entered understood they were witnessing something more significant than automotive repair. They were witnessing the continuation of a legacy that proved ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they had the courage to protect what was right, even when doing so required risking everything they thought they wanted. Frank Mercer had spent 40 years hiding in plain sight, protecting technological innovations that could change the world, while appearing to be nothing more than a reclusive old man. His great-granddaughter had inherited more than his research. She'd inherited his understanding that the most important accomplishments often came from people no one expected to succeed. The afternoon sun streamed through the garage windows, illuminating the space where Frank's legacy lived on. Emma returned to work on the engine modifications that would carry her great-grandfather's innovations into the future. She was no longer just a teenager helping her father with restoration projects. She was Frank Mercer's chosen heir, entrusted with technology that could revolutionize transportation while carrying forward the values that had made such innovation possible: courage, integrity, and the stubborn belief that some dreams were worth protecting no matter what the cost. The garage that everyone had once called complete garbage had become the foundation for discoveries that would influence automotive technology for generations. But more importantly, it had become the place where the Mercer family learned they were worthy of respect, recognition, and responsibility for innovations that could change the world. Emma looked up from her work to see her parents, her uncle, and the various professionals who now sought their expertise, and realized that Frank's greatest achievement hadn't been the revolutionary automotive technology he'd developed. His greatest achievement had been creating conditions where his family could finally discover their own extraordinary capabilities.